Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain and welcome to the top. I've often mentioned in my reviews the DCOMs I consider underrated. Usually, that means that there's a deeper layer that few penetrate or that for whatever reason, the film just didn't grab people when they first premiered. One of my very first videos delved into that area, but now, after almost 2 years, it's high time for an updated list. So, without any further delay, let's kick things off with number 10. On the surface, Princess Protection Program just sounds like it's trying to be a bad movie, but look a little deeper and there's a little more to it than that. It's your fairly standard fish out of water story, but it's so well carried by Selena Gomez and Demi Lovato, a pair who, at least back then, were real life friends. And even though Demi was portraying a princess of a fictional country, that chemistry still found a way through. Selena, on the other hand, plays a variation on Alex Russo, so while it's not exactly novel, you know it'll get the job done. And that's really it. There's a couple of really smart scenes here, a couple of dumb ones, and some expected over-the-top stuff, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the pair of girls on the poster, and they both deliver here. And if you're a fan of either of them or both of them, it's worth checking out, or giving another chance to. Certainly not one of the greatest DCOMs ever made, but pretty solid, and from where I'm standing, underrated. Dwayne Dunham is probably the second best director of DCOMs behind the man himself, and we've talked a lot about why. The way he gets at emotional highs and lows makes his film stand out much more so than your standard fare original movie. Right on Track is a great example of both in an era where sports movies were at their peak. Heck, there was even another racing movie that had similar beats to it. And while many of us praise the great work done in sports movies like Brink or Motocross, I think Right on Track tops them all as one of the greatest DCOMs ever made. Beverly Mitchell in the lead role is spot on in her portrayal of a tough but layered character. The supporting cast almost across the board deliver well, especially the father, and it gets just so many tiny details right alongside the bigger, larger moments. More so than most other sports DCOMs, this is a story that really matters because it really happened, and Dunham films it in a way that properly captures the significance of Erica Enders and her journey. In the highly saturated DCOM genre known as sports movies, Right on Track finds a way to stand out in terms of quality, but not so much popularity, definitely making it underrated. Camp Rock 2 is an interesting sequel. In many respects, it's a departure from the patient and lax way that Matthew Diamond went about filming the original movie. When Paul took over the sequel, he changed the tone, the pacing, and gave the Joe Bros bigger roles. Those modifications proved to be both a good thing and a bad thing. Camp Rock 2 is a dramatic and thematic step up from the first. That doesn't necessarily make it a better overall film, but it does have elements to it that are more advanced, and because of who's directing, those elements really work. But it also holds on to the more carefree moments that should define a film series like Camp Rock because it is still a camp. And with that, you have the other Joe Bros doing their own things, while Demi is in full battle mode for most of the movie. But I think the best detail about this film is the unhappy ending, so to speak. Camp Star wins because the movie informs us that that's what's supposed to happen. It makes sense as a point of contradiction between the mentalities that define the opposing camps. Camp Star literally has star power to influence voting, but Camp Rock won in their own way by holding on to their unique spirit and not becoming Camp Star and losing anyways. That's the point of it all, and that's why you needed that tone change from the first to second film. I still wouldn't call it better than the original because the soundtrack doesn't do as good a job at making the film better, something else we've discussed before, but I still say it's underrated, even among Camp Rock fans. The main reason I placed a swap here, despite it being very recent, is because of how poorly it was advertised and how poorly it did ratings-wise as a direct result. A film several times better than the one this network could not stop hyping was also the one that last year got the proverbial short end of the stick advertising-wise once all that 100th DCOM budget was blown. But I'm here to tell you that despite everything the previews and the trailers and the ridiculous premise would have you believe, this movie is actually very good, and better put together than most recent DCOMs. The idea of body swapping text messages is dumb, we understand that, but it's what they do with that mechanic that makes this film worth it. Beneath the surface of what could have just been Discount Freaky Friday was a tale about healthy emotional expression and how it's used to overcome loss. Both main characters are dealing with a missing parent in their own ways, but by learning from each other's perspectives, they are able to even adjust their parents' views on the idea. The acting is pretty solid throughout. There's some great work done by some choice supporting characters, and the way things are shot, framed, and toned is pretty spot on. There were a handful of mistakes in the form of classic DCOM missteps that kept this film from being great, but it was better than it had any right to be, given how even its own network heavily underrated it. I've brought up this film quite a bit over my time YouTubing, and it's become almost the poster child for not looking deeper than the surface level, which is a shame because there's a ton of really interesting topics and ideas surrounding this movie worth discussing beyond, oh, look, this blonde girl is totally falling for this robot who can sing. The soundtrack is actually pretty solid considering it's only maybe 3 songs, but the real idea behind this movie is the idea of humanity as perfectly imperfect creatures. Being smart is one of the most important things you can be, but what's even more valuable is being balanced. So, the smart thing Paul does with this film is centered around 2 geniuses who have a lot more to learn despite their high IQs. By framing them that way initially, but then placing the more whimsical May at the center point, the perfect boyfriend idea makes sense because who wouldn't want that? But then, her character arc only resolves by realizing not that Albert is a machine per se, because she already knows that, but that this idea of perfection doesn't really exist and that being flawed gives us more as a race to strive for. And that's why the end song literally sings out, "I'd trade it all for something real." That's the entire point of the movie right there in musical form. The funny thing being that since it's a background jam in the context of the movie, there's probably a lot of people who didn't pick that up. How to Build a Better Boy is fairly advanced by DCOM standards in terms of the ideas it speaks on, both on the surface and just beneath it, and for me, that makes it criminally underrated. Speaking of ideas beneath the surface, enter the one film that does the most with the inherently zany, wacky nature of DCOMs by giving all of that a basis in mental psychology. Dadnapped as a film feels like the very culmination of everything Paul Hoen does best as a filmmaker, because it seems like there's always another layer to peel back, always more to say about this detail or that one, that all connects back to how Emily Osment's character relates to her father, who both relate to Trip Zoom. In reality, Trip Zoom isn't just another one of those characters only one person can see or hear, it's actually the manifestation of one girl trying to overcome the divorce of her parents by attempting to normalize and learn from Trip as a way to regain the attention of her estranged father. She blames Trip, not her father, for the broken home she now lives in, so she wants nothing more than to beat him, regardless of the mental taxation it causes. Almost everything we see in this movie is a version of what Emily Osment perceives in her role, which we know because the Dutch angles utilized represents her mental instability, and once you understand that, you're forced to think about what's real and what's her reality pretending to be real. Which parts of the movie are her seeing things clearly, and which parts are her coping mechanism in action? And the answers to both questions exist on a spectrum. That's about as deep as one of these kinds of movies ever get, which is probably why it's so underrated, in spite of the Disney Channel all-star cast they assembled for this one. But, having reviewed this film for over 20 minutes last we discussed it, there will always be more to say than a top video will allow me to, so I'll just say, yeah, it's underrated, and worth taking a deeper look into. It's still somewhat surprising to me that Avalon-High never gained a large following when it premiered. Not as many people watch DCOMs nowadays, but back in 2010, the numbers should have handled themselves, which leads me to believe that this film went through the same arid marketing strategy that doomed the swap, but that's just speculation. The concept and the scale of Stuart Gillard's greatest achievement speaks for themselves, but what really makes this film an all-time great one is its subtle screenplay and well-executed mystery elements. This movie doesn't have the singing and dancing that other films next to it had, but it didn't need it because it had Britt Robertson. Her performance isn't flashy or showy or over the top, it's just right, perfectly fitting into the tenor the film is going for. Add in the wonderful Joey Polari, the sensational Steve Valentine, and even with just an okay Greg Sulkin, you're pretty much set on acting. Then you get to the reveals that I obviously won't spoil here, and the movie comes full circle in a brilliant way. It's focused, it's downplayed, it's detail-oriented, and it makes sense despite the idea of Arthurian legends coming to life in the present day. Given the subject matter, the talent involved, and the great movie they made given all of that, it's a wonder that this movie isn't more popular, but if it was, then it wouldn't be so incredibly and somewhat confusingly underrated. Tiger Cruise is flat out one of the best DCOMs ever made. third as far as I'm concerned, and easily the best movie Dwayne Dunham has ever conceived. The idea of placing it this high is because for some reason it isn't given the same kind of love as the expertly crafted DCOMs I'd place just above it. Not to mention, this Dunham movie usually gets overshadowed by another more popular Dunham movie in Halloween Town, which is still a very good movie, so nothing against it on that level. However, this just might be the most emotional, powerful, and moving film in the history of DCOMs for its careful use of an unforgettable tragedy that still shakes our world to this very day. But, most crucially, it doesn't hit you over the head of the event. The Twin Tower attack is used more as a powerful catalyst for the characters in the film to discover their own inner strength, as well as realizing what really matters in this world. Coming together as a nation and as people is the only silver lining horrifying events like these afford us. And this movie doesn't sugarcoat that either. It's directly implied that their ship, children and all, could have potentially saw active warfare if called upon. The setup, the major tone shift, and the fear that sets in as a result hits every note just right. The direction, acting, and screenplay all work well in service of everything this movie is trying to convey. It is not an easy DCOM to sit through, but it is well worth the watch. And while many people do know just how good this movie is, I still consider it very underrated because it's even better than that. Wendy Wu certainly has its fan base, myself included, and yet it still seems very much overlooked or even disliked by others. But if there was ever a film that places the original in Disney Channel original movie, this would be it, because in so many ways, it's one of the most unique films in the DCOM catalog. The martial arts speak for themselves, and having a DCOM veteran like Brenda Song lead the charge was a nice choice, and it allowed her to mostly break away from that privileged princess sort of shell that she'd been known for until that point. This movie takes that familiar Brenda Song characterization and pushes her to be more through the tutelage of the real-life martial artist known as Shin Koyomada. But what then makes this movie more than just a Power Rangers-esque beat-em-up is the theme of cross-cultural identity and how that theme is presented and handled through the Wu family. The parents here feel a disconnect with the culture that this new guy has been raised to appreciate, and that disconnect created two kids that are even less interested in what it means to be Chinese. And in this film's most brilliant move, it recognizes the distinctions in mindset between Western and Eastern culture, generally speaking, and combines them into a singular vessel. Because Wendy is both Chinese and American, she has a power that previous Yin warriors did not. She has the power to accept her destiny and change it, combining two distinct thought processes into one, thus destroying Yan Lo and saving Shin from what was supposed to be his death. It's probably the smartest DCOM in terms of cultural incorporation since The Color of Friendship, and it kicks butt on top of that. This isn't just a great DCOM, it's a rare one that handles topics and themes unknown to these more modern films, and definitely underrated. But which film tops them all? Some of you already know that much, but first, some honorable mentions. Even after almost 2 years of diving deeper into DCOMs, One World for me still represents the very pinnacle of what it means to be underrated and overlooked, and most of us know exactly why. But here's the thing, the movie works better on a narrative level because Raven isn't there compared to either of the previous two movies. The first one was good, and the second one has the best soundtrack of the trilogy by a wide margin, but in terms of a complete film, One World reigns supreme for these reasons. Firstly, by not having Raven in the cast this time around, the movie could center around who the Cheetah Girls as a musical group are. It correctly shows them struggling a bit to keep their music in line without their focus leader before their Bollywood chant shows up, and then the movie asks, which of these three girls could potentially be the one? A question that Galleria would have immediately shut down, but again, since she's gone, the film uses that as a catalyst to spur on the story, and then that situation is paralleled in a clever way through the three male characters, including the director of their film, who is interested in Chanel, who, just like her, has to go through his own trials as a brand new leader. The ideas of sisterhood, female empowerment, and the worldly perspective that define this musical group since the first movie are all on full display here, both in subtle and surface level ways. And adding to all of those details is the vibrancy and beauty that comes with the location, the shot selection, and the atmosphere that results from a proper combination of the two. Paul has directed a ton of thought-provoking films with important subtext, but here's where his camera work is at its best. The sunset, just look at it, take it all in. The soundtrack could have been better, but even the musical numbers here have a captivating way of being shot at least, which adds to the cultural vibe of the film. So many people, for whatever reason, consider the final Cheetah film to be the worst, but I couldn't disagree more. I think it's a matter of it being a third film, and the fact that Indian culture isn't as relatable as the urban sensibilities of the first or the Spanish representation of the second. But whatever the actual reason, for me, the Cheetah Girls One World retains its title as the most underrated DCOM of all time. As always, make sure to share your own thoughts on which DCOMs you think are underrated and demand more attention. And of course, thanks for watching.